Have you ever been shopping online and looked at different electronic drum sets, noticing two drum sets that look kind of similar to each other, but one literally costs 3 times as much more money than the other one? What are the main differences that separate the ultra expensive drum sets versus the cheaper stuff? That's coming up. What's up? My name is Justin. Welcome to 65 Drums, the place to keep on top of all things Edrum related. Hope you're all having an awesome day. Now, this is a kind of a controversial topic because people get very angry at companies that charge a whole lot of money. And you might think to yourself, oh, the only company he's talking about is Roland. And yes, of course, Roland is the main offender here because their drum sets are incredibly overpriced. But they're literally not alone. Roland has really high prices. Edrums has really high prices for their drum triggers. One trigger can cost like 300 bucks. Drum Tech has really high prices. If you think about it, Yamaha has really high prices. We just never think about it because Roland is even more expensive than them. So there are all these companies out there charging a lot for their products. And when you look at two drum sets that look nearly exactly the same, and one costs 3 times as much more money, what are the components that really differentiate those two drum sets? What about the processing? What about the quality of the individual pads? What about the materials? What exactly separates the really expensive stuff from the cheap stuff? I'm not trying to tell you you should always go and buy the most expensive version of everything. Obviously, we can't do that because we'd be broke 24/7. But there are reasons why the nicer stuff is more expensive, okay? Just because two drum sets look the same doesn't mean the guts inside of them are the same. It doesn't mean the processing unit inside of them are the same. It doesn't mean the durability between the two are going to be the same. So again, I'm not trying to tell you to always go buy the really expensive version. I obviously don't do that. I've bought a Cat Percussion KT4. I bought an Elisa sample pad, but I do realize that there are big differences between the really expensive stuff and the cheap stuff. Starting off the list with number one, a big difference between the really expensive stuff and the really cheap stuff is the quality of rubber that they're using mostly on their cymbals. So for example, I've got two cymbals right here. This is a Cat Percussion 16-inch ride cymbal, 3-zone. This one right here is also a 3-zone. This is a 13-inch Roland CY13R ride cymbal. And from the surface, you'd think, why would this one be that much more expensive? This thing's a lot more expensive than this Cat Percussion ride cymbal. This one's actually made by Medeli. Medeli makes the ones for Cat Percussion. They make them for Simmons. They make them for Alesis. They make a whole lot of different cymbals. Oh, they also make the ones for Pearl. They make those cymbals as well. And they're just everywhere because of how inexpensive they are. But the rubber, the quality of the rubber that they're using here is vastly different. First is how thick the rubber that they're using. This cymbal has a whole lot of plastic. Only like half the cymbal actually has rubber on it. There's a whole section up here that's just a giant sheet of plastic. And the rubber that is here, it's very, very thin. There's not a ton of rubber here. It's thicker on the edge where you have to pinch it to choke the cymbal, but it's a very thin covering of rubber. And as you play on it, you notice that the rebound and how it feels, it just doesn't feel quite as high quality. And you can almost feel the plastic right underneath the rubber that you're playing on. Meanwhile, on more high quality cymbals, not just Roland, but also probably the ATV cymbals, which are incredibly overpriced, and also the Yamaha cymbals, they all use thicker rubber. And the kind of rubber that they're using is higher quality. Not all rubber is created equal. And this stuff just feels nicer to play on. Of course, it's vastly more expensive than that one, but again, it just feels nicer to play on, and that's one big differentiator. Now, another example that I can give you is, actually, just so you know, I'm not just bashing on non-Roland companies, non-Yamaha companies. I actually spent money of my own and bought this. No one gave this to me. No one mailed me this. And I've also bought this. This is an Elisa Sample Pad Pro. Bought it with my own money on eBay. And one of the things that I've noticed when comparing this Elisa Sample Pad Pro versus the Yamaha multi-pad and the Roland multi-pad options, the Roland SPD-SX, I recently played both of those today, and of course I own this one. This one, the playing surface on this is kind of subpar. The rubber that they're using here is very, very cheap. It's nowhere near as nice. It's kind of hard, actually. And when you're playing on it, it's just not as fun to play as the more expensive options. This one, I believe, is like 260 bucks. And it shows in the materials. They had to cut corners somewhere to get it that low in price, okay? The Roland versions and the Yamaha versions, you can just tell by how they sound when you're playing on them, the quality of the rubber that's being used. Also, the thickness of the rubber. When I'm playing on this part of the pad, any of these 6 zones right here, it's less fun to play on versus right up here. This is a raised section of rubber on the top of this Elisa Sample Pad Pro, and since it's a thicker piece of rubber, it just feels nicer to play on it. So I wish the entire pad was that thick, that it had that much rubber there. So yeah, The kind of rubber being used is one of the big differentiators from the overpriced stuff from the really cheap stuff. The second material that differentiates the really expensive stuff versus the cheap stuff is the kind of plastic being used. This is something you might not think about. There's this stigma against plastic that anytime plastic's being used instead of metal, it's always subpar. But really, there's a whole range of plastics. There's the really cheap plastic that you'll find like at Dollar Tree, and then there's military grade plastic. There's a whole range of plastics out there. It's really complicated science. And again, if we go back to cymbals, the cheaper cymbals, when you use these cymbals, you'll notice that the plastic just doesn't feel as nice. In fact, this one right here, I know this was a store unit. This was a floor model. So it took a beating. It got a lot of years of use in a shorter period of time than if just one person had played on it. But this hi-hat actually cracked in half. You see all this? This is Gorilla Glue. I had to glue this hi-hat back together just to use it. It's not actually broken. The triggering and everything is perfectly fine. It's just that the actual plate just snapped in half. The little plastic rods that the screws go through to join these two pieces together, it's just broken. So I glued it back together and it works perfectly fine. But that is sort of telling of the overall quality of the plastic that's being used here. And you'll notice that this is a two-piece system. If you compare that against this Roland cymbal right here, just look at the plastic right here. What looks higher quality? What looks better designed? This right here, this is a much nicer plastic than right here. The quality of the plastic being used is a big differentiator between the really cheap stuff and the higher quality stuff. Another differentiator between the really cheap stuff and the expensive stuff is whether or not it works right out the box. A lot of times, the more expensive drum sets, they pretty much work right out the box. You might have to make some minor adjustments, but nothing really big. Sometimes the cheaper companies, they'll make it so you have to actually spend some time in the module adjusting threshold and crosstalk just to make everything working well after you've bought it brand new. For example, I was recently at a store and I pressed factory reset on this Roland TD25 KV that I was playing. And when I factory restored all the settings just to blank, without having to tweak anything, no threshold, no crosstalk, everything just triggered beautifully. And it was factory restored to factory default trigger settings. That's something that you can't do on everything, for example, in Elisa Strike Pro. A fourth differentiator between the really expensive stuff and the really cheap stuff is how well is the product designed? What's the R&D that went into making this whole pad? Sometimes you'll find a product that just feels a little bit rushed, like you're using a prototype instead of the actual finished product. It's just because the designers weren't given enough time to actually really, fine tune everything. They just had to push out a product that works, but it's not quite as nice as it could be. Now, since I'm still holding the sample pad right now, I'll bring this up as an example. When I'm looking at this, it doesn't feel like a fully finished, fully polished product. It's like the designers ran out of time and they couldn't keep, fine-tuning all the aspects of this pad. For example, just the menu system on here. The menu system is just one screen and it's not very nice because if you want to switch between different kits, there aren't dedicated buttons that let you switch between kits. If you're messing around with the sensitivity or something of one of the pads, you have to press all these arrow buttons all over the place until you can finally reach up to the very top of the screen and then change kits. And also, design comes down to the processor unit that they put inside these things. The load time between switching kits on this is a lot longer than something on like a Roland pad or a Yamaha pad. I guess that might not be a design thing. That's more just like the amount of money they were allowed to spend when designing something. There's probably a dollar limit where they were told you have to design the sample pad for this amount of money. It can't go any higher because we need to get a profit margin and we want to sell the product for this amount of money. So yeah, design comes in to the user interface, the overall design of the product, and how much money they're allowed to spend on the product is also another category. Here's another example of what I'm talking about. This right here is a 10-inch mesh pad from the company Go Edrum. In the early days of this channel, they actually gave me 2 drum sets to review and actually let me keep them. Those are the pads that you see over there stacked against the wall in all of my videos. I put them there because it just looks really cool as a background image. But these shells, they look beautiful. They've got this sparkle red finish on them. Other ones, they have this like wood grain finish on them. The shells, they're made of metal. They're like made of steel. And there's chrome everywhere. They look absolutely beautiful. So this is a 10-inch shell right here. And then this is a Roland PDX 100 pad, okay? So the exact same size. These are both exact same size. This one looks 10 times nicer, okay? It just looks a lot nicer. You can buy them in different shell finishes and stuff. This thing, the shell is actually made of a giant cast of plastic. The build quality of this thing doesn't look anywhere near as nice. However, the triggering performance of this is way nicer because of the internals. The internals of this, it's incredibly simplistic. The kind of foam that they're using is not as nice as what Roland is using. I don't believe the piezo unit inside of here is quite as nice either. The placement of this makes it so it can't do positional sensing. So there's some things about this, even though it looks nicer, the triggering, the guts inside of it, the design, isn't as nice as the Roland option, and that's why this is cheaper. And here's one final thing. Talking about MIDI data. You can plug any drum module into a laptop and trigger Easy Drummer, Steven Slate, Addictive Drums, whatever kind of drum software you want to use. However, the nicer drum sets, the nicer brands, they tend to give you cleaner MIDI data. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot whenever you're just playing drum covers or just playing by yourself and listening through headphones. But when you're doing legit recordings, I've been told that if you get one set of MIDI data from one guy who has a certain drum module and another guy's playing another song with another lesser quality drum module, I don't know if it's a combination of the pads and the module, or maybe the module's the main culprit, but the nicer drum set in general gives you cleaner MIDI data, and you don't have to clean up any sort of weird accidental artifacts later in post. So those are just some things that differentiates the really expensive stuff from the cheap stuff. Before I go any further, I want to just say that I'm not trying to convince you to always go and buy the overly expensive route. I'm just explaining you the material differences, the processing differences, the trigger differences that happen when you buy the more expensive version. Those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think of it down in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in a few.